All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started here. Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Board of Directors and the staff of the New York Center for Foreign Policy Affairs, I would like to welcome you to this important discussion on Libya, the challenges facing this country, its people, and the global influences that exist currently and may set the future of this North African nation. My name is Justin Russell, and as of 2 weeks ago, I am the Principal Director of the Center and am based here at our Washington, D.C. offices. I would like to begin by thanking our panel and the attendees participating in this episode of our continuing series of seminars on foreign policy facing the geopolitical community. I would also like to take a moment and thank our program director here at the Center, Ms. Alyssa Bonk, for producing today's event. Trust me when I tell you, these events are not even possible without the hard work of Alyssa and her team. Before we start, just a couple of housekeeping notes. During the discussion, we would ask that the participants today please ensure that the microphones remain on mute as not to disturb the presentation of our panelists or the panelist discussion. We will have short presentations by each of our experts, and then we will go to a panel discussion, and towards the end of the program, we will open up the floor to questions. Those questions you'll be able to post on either those attending by Zoom. You can post it as a chat message up in the Zoom chat. For those that are participating outside of Zoom, you can tweet your questions or email your questions to info@NYCFPA.org, and we'll get them read as they come in. Well, with that, let's begin. Along the northern coast of the African continent, on the southern region of the Mediterranean Sea, lies an oil-rich strategic jewel that currently poses a foreign policy and national security challenge not only to the United States, but to our allies and foreign adversaries alike. It is a nation that recently has been the center of conflict and instability. It is a nation that has seen leadership from a tyrannical leader, an uprising by the people dedicated to change, internal fighting, and human rights challenges. It has been the center of political and national security battles both inside its borders and outside its sovereign control. It continues to see infighting among factions seeking control of the government. It continues to have outside influences attempt to set the direction for the future of this nation. It is a nation that faces challenges that will determine not only its own destiny, but the future of this highly volatile region. And that is our discussion for today. Let me start off by introducing our panelists, and they'll present their comments on this. First, I have the privilege to introduce Jalel Harchaoui. Jalel joined the Conflict Research Unit of the Clingendael Institute in February of 2019 as a research fellow. His work focuses on Libya, covering aspects such as the country's security landscape and political economy. Jalel holds a master's degree in geopolitics, and his doctoral research is focused on international dimensions of the Libyan conflict. A frequent commentator on Libya in the international press, he has been published widely, including in Foreign Affairs, Lawfare, Politique étrangère, Middle East Eye, and Small Arms Survey. With that, again, it is my privilege to introduce Jalel. Jalel, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Alyssa, for the invitation. I feel greatly honored. My presentation is going to focus on the international dimension, which is a little bit counterintuitive, but it's obviously a dimension that keeps getting more and more important when it comes to this particular civil war. That being said, what we've heard a lot, particularly this year, is phrases like the civil war of Libya is getting internationalized, or something like the number of states interfering in Libya keeps getting greater and greater. And those perceptions are obviously completely false. More than 5 years ago, if you went back, let's say, to late 2014, the states interfering in Libya were exactly the same as today. And the notion of an internationalized civil war was already documented. What changed is not so much the proxy aspect, is the fact that states now feel encouraged by the aloofness of the United States that seems to show less and less interest vis-a-vis that time zone. And as a result, they basically intervene directly. And that directly changes depending on the state that you look at. I would like to mention just 3 dates. In April 2019, I mean, obviously the civil war has been going on, and there's a lot of fault lines, a lot of grievances, and there's nothing really new under the sun that popped up last year or this year. Uh, as it's the mode of action that changed. And in April 2019, an important moment began when the UAE, on a clandestine basis, started bombing the area of an important capital on the North African coast, Tripoli. So it was done. It was, if it happened on a daily basis for months on end, and it was done on a clandestine basis. So it was a military intervention that was not openly admitted to or acknowledged. And then there was another moment, a clandestine moment as well, which is Turkey a few weeks later sent a bunch of drones and maybe 5 or 6 dozen intelligence officers on a clandestine basis to intervene as well. It was much smaller than the operation of the UAE. Another date, the first week of September 2019, for the first time in the Tripoli area on the outskirts of the capital, we're seeing a bunch of Russian mercenaries. So of course, the mercenary aspect means that it was also clandestine and not acknowledged. You probably heard of the phrase plausible deniability. Whether it's plausible or not, it's denied anyway. And this is the big event, is that Turkey decided to intervene again. It's a brand new intervention, much larger, much larger. And it decided to do away with the clandestine aspect. Not completely. It basically created a new format that is hybrid, somewhere between clandestine and completely overt and official. And this is the reason everybody started talking about the international intervention of the Libyan conflict. It was because it was, this non-European, Muslim, non-Arab, non-African state that decided to introduce a very bold and candid format. So in the next few minutes, I would like to just go through a few notions to help you maybe think about the reasons, because in geopolitics, scholars, whether it's international relations or political science, they don't like to study the motivations, particularly when a state intervenes militarily in another country that never attacked it. This is a question that is usually avoided. Why did let's say Saddam Hussein invade Iran in 1980? Those types of questions are usually avoided, and as a result, there's very little consensus even decades later. And this is basically what I would like to kind of focus on for the next couple of minutes, and to help you kind of distinguish the various categories. There are two principal groups of reasons. One is when there's an actual legitimate concern about conventional security. A state feels that the country next door might physically invade it. It might attack it, or it might instigate a coup, something that involves a physical intervention. So you want to preempt that and you attack first. This case exists in history, but there's another case, which is something that we tend to forget about, and it involves a non-conventional definition of security. It has to do with ideological security or ideational security. When the thing that you worry about is the fact that an opinion that you dislike because it contradicts the model that you have in mind and you view yourself as a regional hegemon, let's say, and you decide to use military force because you determined that if you don't do that, what might happen is that the wrong opinion could spread really quickly among the population and you could lose control over your own constituencies domestically, for instance, or around you. And this is really the concept of ideational security or ideological security that is key if you wish to understand what motivates one of the most determined, dogged, obstinate interferer in Libya, the UAE. As of a year ago, it was the most consequential one. Now it's kind of less important because Turkey outsized it. It really decided to go big in Libya. But the UAE over the last several years has really had a big impact on Libya, and it's always good to remember that its objectives are not military in the conventional sense. And I would like to finish on this is the fact that if you study, let's say, Egypt or Turkey or Saudi Arabia, the first question that I would tend to recommend as a suggestion is to see if the country that goes into Libya in this case is driven by traditional parameters like economic concern, wanting to have a better geostrategic control over, let's say, over the northern part of Africa, because you have this ambition of exporting more across all of Africa, and you do not want to be excluded for what you see as the passageway into this very important continent. Or you're worrying, in fact, about ideas and opinions, and you want to fight, let's say, the existence of a political party, even if it doesn't attack you physically. And this is actually, and that's a paradox, it makes you more violent, because by definition, you want to eradicate an idea. And to eradicate an idea, in, let's say, in this example, a big city like Tripoli, you have to really be extremely violent for a long, long time before you get to that, because it's an absolutist objective. Now, just to finish, on Egypt, I would like to say that there are right now two Egypts, and it's basically a tug of war that you could visualize in your head in Cairo. You have the Egypt of the last several decades, which is a big nation state with a big population, a problematic economy that's really struggling with a lot of troubles. And that one tends to worry about conventional stability. It really cares about just having peace and quiet in the eastern part of Libya and not go crazy because it's not realistic. And then you have another one, which has to do with the roots of the current regime or the current government, which emerged effectively in July 2013. And that entity cannot ignore the ideological obsessions of its own system, but also of its Gulf sponsors. And here you go again, you end up with ideological obsessions and you are pushed, you feel pulled into a more violent kind of, or more ambitious, I should say, type of format of intervention. And as I speak to you, there's a debate right now in Cairo, which needs to decide, does Egypt go along with its traditional friend of the last several decades, the capital of realism, Moscow, or does it go with the capital of ideological obsessions like Abu Dhabi? And that decision hasn't been made. And in many ways, it's being decided right now in Sirte, because there's a battle of Sirte that hasn't been resolved. And the diplomatic overtures over the last few days kind of dried up. And unfortunately, that question of where Western Libya has to begin or has to end and where Eastern Libya must start is going to most probably going to be resolved through the Battle of Sirte and maybe another battle in Jufra, maybe another battle in Sabha, because at the end of the day, diplomacy seems to be in trouble again. Thank you very much.
You're on mute, Justin, by the way.
Justin, you're on mute.
That is fantastic. This is the greatness of Zoom. So anyway, let me try this again. By the way, thank you, Jalel. That was fantastic. Joining us right now, I've got the honor of introducing our next panelist. Our next panelist today is Emily Leslie. Emily Leslie is a politician and has a background in behavioral health and international human rights law. Emily worked as a legislative coordinator for Amnesty International and specialized in extremism and women's issues. She is also part of the New York Center for Foreign Policy Affairs team, and we are just truly grateful to have Emily as part of our panel today. So Emily, the floor is yours, ma'am.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. So for my portion, I'm going. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. So as far as Libya goes, we've seen that militias, armed groups, and security forces have committed serious violations of international humanitarian law, and those include war crimes, from fighting in and around Tripoli between forces and militias loyal to the government or the National Court, which is the GNA, and the LNA, and this killed scores of civilians. The human rights violations go from arbitrary arrests and detention, which include torture and ill treatment, hostage taking, freedom of expressions, women's rights. Libyan authorities failed miserably to protect women, and that's including journalists, bloggers, and halted any type of freedom of expression. And the as far as the armed conflict goes, we've seen that militias and armed groups and security forces continue with impunity serious violations of international humanitarian law, including possible war crimes. And these are gross human rights violations. And according to the UN support mission in Libya, in the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, there were at least 284 civilians who were killed and 363 injured as a result of the armed conflict in 2019. And the majority of these deaths and injuries were the result of violations of international humanitarian law by the LNA and GNA, including indiscriminate attacks, including using inaccurate explosive weapons within populated civilian areas, and airstrikes, barrages, and shelling destruct civilian homes and other civilian infrastructures. So this did not, when we say indiscriminate, we mean, you know, hospitals, anywhere where civilians were. It was all, everyone was vulnerable to these attacks from both sides. And the list of human rights violations for Libya just continues on and on and on. And the situation for the tens and thousands of refugees and asylum seekers and migrants remained extremely bleak in 2019 as they were exposed to arbitrary arrest and abduction by militias and were regularly the victims of human trafficking and abuses by criminal groups. The authorities continue to unlawfully detain thousands of people in centers run by the General Directorate for combating illegal migration. And all of these, the most vulnerable were subjected to exploitation, forced labor, and tortured. And this included rape, and often that would be to extract money from families in exchange for release. So, and this is 2019. So Libya has a history of, since this conflict has begun, of extreme human rights violations, even before that. And there are a number of groups that have, reported on this and discussed that within the armed conflict, there are multiple cases of violations to international humanitarian law and human rights law.
Fantastic. Emily, thank you very much for that. I'm truly grateful, and thanks for coming on board with us today. Next, our next presenter, I've got the honor of introducing Emadeddin Badi. Emadeddin is a non-resident senior fellow with the Middle East program at the Atlantic Council, where he focuses primarily on US and European policies towards Libya and the wider geopolitical implications of the conflict. Previously, he was a non-resident scholar at the Counterterrorism and Extremism program at the Middle East Institute. Emadeddin has also worked on multiple research and policy-oriented projects with various institutions, with an extensive focus on Libya's non-state actors. He is also currently affiliated with the School of Transnational Governance at the European University Institute in Florence, Italy, where he focuses on EU policy towards Libya. Emadeddin, the floor is yours, sir.
Okay, so all right, I'm assuming everyone can hear me properly, although I do hear some echo. My intervention is primarily going to be focused on the use of mercenaries in the Libya conflict. As Jalel pointed out earlier, the maybe interventionism in Libya wasn't new. However, what's definitely new and what's exploded over the past year or so is definitely the transfer of mercenaries towards Libya. I'll maybe give a lay of the field on when mercenaries were transferred, and then perhaps shed light on which ones are primarily involved for commercial purposes, or let's say are fighting for actual money, and which ones have been transferred by particular states to advance certain policy agendas. So since last year, the big piece of news, or the most numerous numbers of mercenaries have been are currently the GNA's, the Government of National Accord Syrian Turkmen, that were transferred around December to help the Government of National Accord thwart Haftar's offensive after the two infamous memorandums of understanding that were signed between the GNA and Ankara. However, what's maybe not often shed light on is the fact that before that, Haftar had problems of manpower himself. So his Libyan Arab Armed Forces were not all of it mobilized from Eastern Libya, and not all of the individuals that are affiliated with the LAAF as such wanted to go towards Tripoli. So he had a manpower problem by design, and that's why he primarily relied on not just Libyans, but also Sudanese mercenaries as part of his offensive. So these were often in the rear guard. They weren't clearly visible in the conflict. However, at times they were also spearheading ground offensives, and they were captured as either prisoners of war or killed throughout the past year. And there's a lot of open source evidence to that effect. After Gharian was captured last year, which was one of the two bases that Haftar relied on for his offensive, because he relied on two cities or two supply nodes, let's say. Actually, Russia sent in its Wagner mercenaries, its infamous Wagner mercenaries. These were deployed towards Tripoli's front lines, and their effect was really to have, they had a multiplier effect. They allowed the LAAF to really not just maintain a defensive line, but to actually push into Tripoli's suburbs. So from, let's say, September to November last year, Wagner mercenaries were actually the ones that were primarily enabling the LAAF's advance towards Tripoli. And then came the Syrian Turkmen that were transferred by Turkey after the MOU with with the government of national accord. I will also say that the GNA tried and successfully did actually recruit some Chadian mercenaries throughout last year as part of its defense, let's say. However, these are nowhere near the number of Sudanese mercenaries that Haftar has relied on. Amongst all of these mercenaries, I will say that most of these are actually involved for commercial purposes. So most of these are actually fighting for money, if not all of them. However, I will say that the Wagner mercenaries in particular are the ones that are there to advance a particular policy agenda on behalf of the Kremlin. So these have been transferred in September. They weren't transferred in particular to enable Haftar to capture Tripoli, but they were transferred to enable Russia to gain some form of leverage over not just Haftar, but the Eastern Libyan bloc as a whole. And that's the reality that we have. That's part of the reason why we have the reality that we have today, whereby Russia is actually the one calling the shots. And as Jalel pointed out, the UAE is kind of falling a bit in the background right now. That doesn't mean that it's irrelevant at this stage, but the fact that Russia has its own mercenaries and that these were instrumental for the Tripoli offensive and are now instrumental also for whatever happens in Sirte moving forward in central Libya, that kind of highlights how important Russia and its involvement is. Lately, there have also been a lot of credible reports about the transfer of Syrians, but this time not on the government of national accord side, but actually pro-Assad Syrian fighters so the Wagner group is actually conducting the hiring in Syria with Russian army supervision and are transferring these fighters to Eastern Libya. These are also involved for commercial activities, and I suspect they will be primarily actually used as cannon fodder of sorts for Haftar, because he still has the same manpower problems that he had before, if not more. Now, why these were transferred the way they were transferred on the Russian side, I think we could take a page out of the Ukraine playbook and maybe guess why. It gives plausible deniability. First of all, it masks, or you kind of avoid public scrutiny in terms of a overt involvement, let's say. So Russia wasn't really willing to go all the way like Turkey did. It didn't want to have an open intervention like it did in Syria. And last but not least, even if some of these mercenaries die, it doesn't cause that much of a public relations or PR issue in Russia itself. However, clearly in January, that their presence was kind of the premise behind which Russia relied on. That's what was used by Russia as a bargaining chip to negotiate a ceasefire with Turkey. And these mercenaries will still be, along with now the recently transferred Russian jets towards Eastern Libya that African publicized. These are going to be the leverage that Russia will use in the upcoming period. So I'll leave it at that. Maybe we can get more questions in the Q&A.
Absolutely, absolutely. Ahmad, thank you very much for that presentation. Finally, I've got the honor of introducing Pervez Bilgrami for today's program. Pervez is a political analyst who follows geopolitical and security trends in the greater Middle East with a particular focus on Turkey, Iran, Pakistan, and Libya. He has written for various platforms and has also been translated into several languages, including French, Spanish, Arabic, Turkish, Albanian, Chinese, Thai, and Indonesian. With that, Pervez, you have the floor, sir. Did we lose Pervez?
I think Pervez is going to mute his. Pervez?
I love Zoom. Well, if we can get Pervez back,
Here, he's just, I'm not sure why we can't unmute him.
give him another second.
He is here.
Okay. Well, why don't we go ahead with questions and answers right now? We'll just start the dialogue, and if we can get him back, Alyssa, why don't you see if we can't get him back online, audio-wise? But let's go ahead and start with the discussion if we can, and we'll jump in when Pervez is ready to go. I want to start off by kind of breaking this down to the basic common denominator, and I think one of the questions whenever we talk, particularly here in the United States, about Libya, the first words that come out of politicians and armchair quarterbacks in foreign policy is the term failed state. I want to ask just the broader panel, is Libya in fact a failed state? Jalel, we'll start with you on that answer.
I mean, as someone who has studied this tendency on the part of multiple states interfering, starting in February 2011, really, and never really stopping after this, I never found this concept of a failed state particularly useful. And I think it's a worthy question, and it could be addressed. There's a lot of literature on it, and I think you could argue that indeed, if you take a snapshot of, say, Libya in 2012, the beginning of 2012 or the end of 2012 look very, very different. And a lot of opportunities were missed during that particularly quiet year. I mean, if you look at the first few months, you know, some people would say that NATO destroyed Libya. That's obviously completely false, because everything was pretty much running during the first few months of 2012. The banking system was running, the universities were open, the foreign exchange rate was functioning, the black market was not needed, and so on and so forth. And you could travel. There's no apparent problem. But and then at the end of the year, it started looking like a very worrisome picture. And you could argue that it was because you know, all those opportunities in terms of governance were missed. But what I find very interesting is that throughout that period, so you can start in February 2011 all the way to today, Libya never had the time to be alone with itself. And of course, if a country is trying to come out of 42 years of dictatorship, let's use that word adequately, and then you have much more wealthier, you know, much more bold countries interfering during that moment, then is it really because the Libyans failed? Yes, of course, you could build an argument towards that. But what strikes me is the fact that it really never had any moment of solitude to be able to screw up on its own. It doesn't even own its own failure. So that's the reason I don't think it's a particularly useful concept.
Do you agree with that? I mean, can we look at the security issue and the involvement of outside forces without having to look at the baseline fact of, is Libya a failed state or not? I mean, is that reaching too deep?
I mean, I think what's maybe Jalel is getting to is that often what happened with Libya is the fact that from a, let's say, conceptual perspective, the concept of sovereignty was not respected by design almost. The 2011 intervention was opened the floodgate for interventions at large bilaterally. And what that caused, from my perspective at least, is that Libya was always at the intersection of geopolitical rivalries or states jockeying for having a certain degree of influence in the Libyan landscape. That included European states as much as it did include also Gulf states. And right now, in the past year or so, I would say that one of the maybe rifts that has emerged or that influenced the involvement of Turkey, the more overt, let's say, involvement of Turkey, and the reactive, in a way, involvement of Turkey in May last year by sending in the weaponry covertly, was maybe its actual rivalry with the UAE for intra-Sunni hegemony in a way. But then that bled, another kind of geopolitical rivalry bled into another one, and now we have Libya being, first of all, at the fault line of the Eastern Mediterranean competition between several other states, some of which were not involved prior to this war in Libya, most notably Greece, for example. And you have the return to a certain extent of great power competition, and with the US being very reactive to the Russian presence. So you have all these geopolitical dynamics, and you have no way of kind of shielding Libya from the geopolitical context around it. So it's very simple to say Libya is a failed state after 42 years of dictatorship. It's a lot more difficult to be nuanced and analyze why that happened and what drove a lot of states to approach Libya as an open space where they could intervene.
Right. I believe we've got Pervez back. Pervez, are you on?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you. Pervez, if you have comments, or we can go right into directions, the floor is yours, or we can stay with the Q&A.
Yes. Actually, let me begin with my subject that you gave me, addressing the U.S. stance in Libya, then Russia, U.S. supporting the rivalry. So let me briefly addressing the troubled relation between the United States and Libya, going back to the Gaddafi era, the Berlin at bombing, the U.S. blame, the U.S. blame on Libya, the retaliatory bombing by U.S. in February in Benghazi that culminated into the local weekend bombing tragedy. Then came Arab Spring, when the U.S. again bombed Libya to oust the Gaddafi regime from power. Actually on the auspice of the resolution. Then came U.S. Government of Nation Report, GNA relation. On the request of GNA, government U.S. bombed IS position, ISIS or whatever you call it, ISIN position in other parts of Libya. That is around 2016. Then in April last year came Khalifa Haftar's operation. The Libyan Nation Army, the self-described name. Then US decided not to side with the GNA during Haftar's brutal assault on Tripoli and surrounding area. Then came, Turkish formidable military support that turned table around after it became clear that Haftar could not capture the capital Tripoli. US Secretary of State Pompeo called UN-backed government help by al-Sarraj. Then came Russia in the picture, and that made US uneasy with the Russian military support to Haftar, who is also backed by NATO member France and US closest non-naturalized, the UAE, the Egypt, directly, then Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Israel from back. So as far as U.S. interest in Libya are concerned, that goes beyond the Libyan oil reserve, which are very important for some European countries, especially Italy. So U.S. seems to take position that actually that what U.S. wants, the U.S. interest in Libya is that U.S. wants that there should be no anti-U.S. government in Mediterranean basin country. So U.S. had, as far as Europeans are concerned, they have interest in Libyan oil and other illegal migrant issues and refugees. But U.S. had not much interested as to who will emerge victorious in controlling Libya in general and Tripoli in particular, as long as there is no risk that an anti-U.S. group emerge victorious in Libya. But Russian military intervention to support Haftar has changed the dynamics in Libya. That came actually after a delayed U.S. response that provided Russia to drag its feet in Libya and lately emerged as a formidable backer of Khalifa Haftar. With its influence in Libya, Russia is in position to leverage an existing oil and gas supply routes to the energy deficient Europe, and also preventing energy supply routes to Europe that will increase Europe's dependence on Russian oil and gas supplies. As we know that Italy has already surpassed Turkey as the second largest importer of Russian gas after Germany. So military intervention on the side of Haftar provided Russia a foothold in North Africa and increased its influence in an ever important region of Mediterranean Sea. So Russia will most probably have, as we know that Russia has a base in Syria and Mediterranean, that is Tartus. Russia will probably have another naval base in Mediterranean. And as we know that Soviets used to have two military naval bases, like in Tripoli and Tobruk, and we know that Tripoli is in GNA control, so Tobruk is open for Russia, that is under Haftar's control. So what US would not like to see Russians turns Libya into a new Syria. But to prevent this, US have, as I say, the two options. Either US should significantly increase its support to GNA, or alternatively, if US feels reluctant or carry on with this ambiguity of who's supporting which side in Libya, then this reluctant side then that can US can lead towards Turkey-backed GNA against the Russian-backed LNA. Then to stay relevant in Libya, US may become also tempted to create its own political armed group, as it has created one in Syria. On one side in Syria there is Russia, on the other side that supports Assad, and the other side the position that Turkey supports, and there is on the third front that the US had opened by creating the Syrian Democratic Front SDF that it supports. Led by military, led by the YPG, Syrian, offshoot of PKK. So, in spite of Turkey urging many a times, and also the Libyan government of National Accord has urged US to openly support its stance on Libya, US carried on with this ambiguous policy on supporting or not supporting, or stay neutral, or both the LNA and the GNA. So even after Department of Defense rang alarm bells about increasing Russian role in Libya, but pressuring Russia also means for US to countering its most trusted allies, that is France on one side, then UAE, Egypt on the other side. By clearly supporting GNA at international diplomatic front and offering some material support, may help GNA to gradually increase its control, beyond Sirte, that is right now fighting to control.
Right.
That can prevent Russia to exploit the situation in Libya after they did the same in Syria. That will not only help checking Russian venture in Libya, but also strengthen US relations with the Turkey, the key backer of the GNA. Now coming back to increased Russian presence in Libya, that facilitated improved relations with Syrian strongman Assad and Haftar. We know that numerous flights between Damascus and Benghazi carried thousands of Assad militias to support Haftar's military operation in Western Libya. It seems Syrianization of Libya is becoming reality with the Russian intervention. In case US reacts late or is still remain ambiguous to its support to GNA, the dialogue to find solution of Libyan crisis, will shift from Geneva, Berlin, and Milan to Ankara and Moscow. So Russia would want Haftar to control maximum, infrastructure of Libyan oil, so that it would provide Russia a significant power in Libya, and that can exert in the Mediterranean, and as we know that Libyan oils, 80% of Libyan oil, pre-war Libyan oil used to go to Europe, and out of that, Italy was the major importer with around 33% of Libyan oil.
Right.
So the policy paralysis in the US when it comes to Libya also emanates from US and its NATO and non-NATO allies in the region, where they have uneasiness with the growing Turkish influence in North Africa. They have significantly reduced it by 2013 coup in Egypt that ousted Muslim Brotherhood's Morsi, and they have installed military general al-Sisi. So the full-fledged support to GNA that provided Turkey with a significant reputation boost in Algeria. And after losing Egypt in 2013, it has boosted Turkey's position not only in Libya, but also in Algeria and Tunisia. As well as in the Kingdom of Morocco. Erdogan is within a few days' time is meeting the Jordanian king. Jordan may well be encouraged to lean towards politically and militarily assertive Turkey in North Africa. So Turkey would ideally want to clear an ambiguous US support for the UN-recognized GNA. This would arguably bring about stability in the country and also check Russian expansionism in the Mediterranean and North Africa.
Right.
That would bolster Turkey's diplomatic position within the NATO and in the EU. Ultimately, that would pave the way for also the US to re-engage more proactively in order to resolve US-Turkey strategic discord that emanates in Syria after both the sides are supporting the different sides.
Right.
So I am concluding here by stating again the 3 bold points that I have mentioned for US stance in Libya. Firstly, US has to leave this ambiguity whether on which side it supports. I mean, now GNA is sure to control the Tripoli, capital Tripoli, and the Western Libya. So US has to support either to GNA and leave LNA that is more in control of Russia right now, or US has the other option that it did in Syria, that it creates a third group that is directly politico-military group that will directly be under US influence in Libya.
Right.
So here are the 3 bold points that I mentioned: US, Russia, in Libya. Thank you very much.
Very good. Thank you, Pervez. Getting back to the question and answers issue, we have a couple of questions regarding the Turkish-Libyan maritime agreement that seems to be rearing its head up even as recently as within the last week, where joint Turkish and Libyan naval exercises were taking place off the coast of Libya. I guess I'll open it up to the panel. I'll start with Emad first. Is this a significant change in the dynamic that's happening, not just from a political standpoint, but from a security and defensive standpoint in Tripoli? Emad, I'll start with you.
From a security, you mean from a security and defensive standpoint, is the MOU relevant, or are the 2 MOUs relevant?
Well, number one, it seems to me that there's a lot of how's the right way to say this? It seems to me that there's a lot of focus in Tripoli as to the enhancement of the Turkish-Libyan maritime agreement. And with the execution of these naval exercises, it just seems that Turkey's kind of the lead horse in this, in a very strategic part of the Mediterranean, in a very strategic part of North Africa. I guess the question is, not only is it relevant, but how nervous should our allies and even the region be about this?
I think that regardless, at this stage, this is essentially a fait accompli. So what Turkey did is essentially it adopted I will say, Haftar's policy of imposing a fait accompli and then letting the international community in a way deal with it the way it sees fit. But I would say that there is I see very little opportunity for Turkey to be leaving Western Libya at this stage, or for it not to scale up the degree to which it's involved in Western Libya without getting some concessions, or without at least getting a conversation open with the U.S. allies on the other side with regards to their interpretation as to the maritime borders in the Mediterranean, or in the Eastern Mediterranean more broadly. What could happen, and what is, I believe, currently happening anyway, is that bilaterally, Turkey is trying to influence Russia, it's trying to influence Israel, it's also trying to influence Egypt into adopting or cozying up, let's say, to its interpretation of the maritime borders. And in that way, they would isolate Greece and Cyprus. Yes.
Let me jump in on that one, because I want to follow up on that thought, Amadi. Is it strikes me that with Tripoli and Ankara conducting just blatant military naval exercises off the coast of Libya, that to me seems like a really big fuse to light in a very sensitive region of that part of the world. Because we know that, as was stated before, the Russians have been looking for a strategic port on the Mediterranean with that kind of access to the Atlantic. We even have allies in NATO that are divided on their positioning, whether they are GNA or LNA supportive. This just seems like a poke in the eye by Turkey to not just NATO, but showing that, I mean, is this a flexing of the muscles for Turkey?
I don't think, but yeah, well, in the terms of whether it's a flexing of the muscles, yes, definitely. But in terms of whether Turkey is exclusively being a belligerent, let's say, I don't think so. What Turkey is trying to do, I believe, from my perspective at least, is it's trying to play, granted a very precarious game, but a game nonetheless, whereby it is trying to leverage its relationship with NATO. It is trying to leverage its relationship with the US. And the threat being that if it does not manage to get the concessions that it wants, it will have a rapprochement of sorts with Russia. So that is, I believe, what is currently going on. And the fact of the matter is, at the end of the day, some states will have to open up a conversation with Turkey about its interpretation of the maritime agreement, because this isn't right now a fait accompli, and Turkey is in Libya, and it won't be moving out unless that conversation is open.
Jalel, do you agree?
Well, I would like to just say one thing about the question, like this. You're worried about this potential fuse, but when we ask those questions, we always, and I understand it because I think in the same way, and I learned to unlearn that because it implies an international order. And to have an international order in that part of the world, it means that somebody must feel responsible for it. Well, guess what? Historically, it hasn't been built by the Europeans. It has been built by the Americans. And the Americans can't be bothered. They're obviously in the process of leaving. That trend began probably right after the Iraq War in 2006. It hasn't been a straight line. It has been an ambivalent, slow, zigzaggy kind of phenomenon, but the trend is clear. Everybody, except the Europeans apparently, is aware that the US is hitting the exit. So this means that the main custodian of this notion of an order it just doesn't exist anymore. And to understand the attitude of the UAE, Turkey, and Russia, is that those people understood that it was now that the Europeans were not interested in the security of their own vicinity. They're not going to, maybe they will bark, but they're not going to do anything. And that is a bet, because it could turn out to be wrong. You know, after all, France is intervening in the Sahel. Maybe it will do something. It's always a possibility. But it's a rational bet, nevertheless. And I think this is this disconnect that is, number one, giving rise to the crisis, and also it helps you understand the attitude of those non-African, non-European states that do have a military capability that they're willing to use as opposed to the Europeans. And it's very important to really question the consistency and the clarity of the American attitude in that area.
Emily, let me go to you on this, because Jalel's comments lead up to something that I think is very striking and very important. You know, Jalel talks about the European and even the U.S. punching the exit button to get out of the region, and Libya in particular. We've seen reports recently of mass graves that are being reported by UN inspectors and U.S. or UN authorities and UN inspectors, rather, that is drawing a lot of concern from senior leadership, not only in the UN, but also in NATO, apparently, as well. Does the fact that, number one, to Jalel's point, we don't even have an embassy in Tripoli. We have to do this kind of telecommuting embassy issue. Does the fact that our policy has kind of been hands-off not drive these types of possible human rights violations to the forefront of the international ire? Or is it not at the tipping point where it should really get our attention that we need to be concerned?
Well, I mean, the mass graves, I mean, I'm sure we've all seen the reports just as early as yesterday about another mass grave being found and discovered. Now, should this, I think your question is, should this, you know, draw us closer to getting involved or having an intervention of some type? Obviously, as a human rights advocate, I absolutely believe so. And it's unclear to me that and it seems to me that every single time we have another report of another mass grave being discovered by civilians, it's sort of like, it's like we just keep passing the buck, so to speak. It just doesn't seem like it's becoming you know, it's just not in the forefront of what's being talked about. And we do have all these, you know, as far as the United States go, I mean, that's my opinion. And the UN, you know, the recommendations for the interventions are, of course, that, you know, Turkey, Russia, the UAE, they cease violating the UN arms embargo. And it's the civilians in Libya who are paying the price as all these parties escalate the retaliatory attacks, and are showing complete disregard for laws of war and the lives of civilians. So I think that it's very clear to me that this should be something that we should be involved in, and that there should be, you know, I mean, they're violating a UN arms embargo, and it's the civilians who are, you know, finding these mass graves and these acts of retaliation that keep happening repeatedly to the civilians. And I think that it's, and it's not just the mass graves. I mean, there are just numerous accounts of, you know, testimony videos that are being taken of, you know, looting, murder, these, and the Turkish arms and equipment being transferred. There are all kinds of reasons for us to intervene, and the fact that I mean, just as early as yesterday, I believe, you know, uncovering another mass grave. These are all, there are obviously huge violations happening here, and there's so many people involved that need, or the countries involved all need to end their involvement immediately in this, and investigate it. And I think that
Right.
justice for the Libyan people should be high on the agenda.
Right, right. Pervez, along the same lines, you know, we look at who the major players are. You know, you talked about Turkey. Turkey is obviously in the lead, but it just seems that Libya is creating a very different foreign policy and national security discussion, even within the NATO allies. I mean, we look at, for example, the allies that support the GNA. You know, we talk about the major players that are involved with the discussions involving Libya. I guess my question to you is, you know, we've got an ambassador in Richard Norland who is kind of not only taking a hands-off approach, but we have a British ambassador in Frank Baker who's pretty much saying, I'm still trying to learn the lay of the land. But we're seeing more and more influence by outside influencers, i.e. the UAE rep in Libya, Aref El Nayed. We look at Russian ambassador Molotov, even Chinese ambassador Ma. It just seems that for every one step forward that the U.S. is trying to do in the region, that these other players are taking us one step back. Is there a way that we can regain at least some sort of balance in Libya that could be beneficial, or at least be neutral to U.S. foreign interests?
See, the situation in Libya is, you know, it's the civil war, and it's going on from 2011 onwards. So when United States, you know, initially there were players like United States, France, Italy, UK. So when these players were unable to solve, you know, the imbroglio there, then other players came in. Then came, you know, Turkey, then came UAE, the neighbor, Egypt. You know, after 11 and 13, there was a coup in Egypt, and then UAE Saudi-backed regime came in Egypt. So now there an alliance emerged that, you know, supported Khalifa Haftar, you know, assuming that he will be able to control entire Libya. But, you know, when he failed to control entire Libya, the permutation and combination of the ground changed. When then came, you know, Turkey with full-fledged military support to the GNA, and that stopped you know, the ambitions of Egypt, UAE, France, and others. So at that time, whoever were able to control Tripoli, that was not going to matter for USA, as long as USA has influence on the rulers of Tripoli, whether they were supported by the France or US, France or Egypt or UAE, or by Turkey. But active Russian involvement in, you know, last one year or so, I mean, it increased leapfolds in last few months, has changed, you know, the ground reality in Libya. With Russian involvement, that what Russia needs, you know, the geopolitical interest of Russia is that is to have, you know, influence on its the major exports of, you know, that is, you know, energy, oil and gas, and then arms. Then yes, you're saying something, Jalel?
No, Pervez, I actually want to jump in on that, because we're talking a lot about Russia, but it seems that the other hidden factor that we're not really addressing, not our group, but it just seems that the geopolitical community globally isn't addressing, is the Chinese investment of their power. And by power, I mean lots of money. The Chinese have been investing a lot of money into infrastructure. They've been investing into the oil fields in Libya. Is that a bigger danger, the commerce side, and does that fortify the position of Prime Minister al-Sarraj?
You know, the Chinese play a silent game from the back. I mean, they do not militarily involve in conflicts. So whoever comes in power, whether it's LNA controlled or GNA controlled, the Tripoli, I mean, the capital is important. So Chinese will be able to deal with them, yeah, when it comes to do trade and business. So for Chinese, you know, if Russia controls the Tripoli through LNA, that is a, you know, a plus for them. Even if Turkey controls Tripoli with the GNA, Chinese can do business with them.
Right, Jalil, to a bigger extent, does the Chinese silent rule in Libya pose a threat to the other players, i.e. the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Emiratis? Jalil, did we lose Jalil?
No, I'm here.
Oh.
I mean, I would like to kind of a little bit push back on this Chinese thing, because I would still argue that the Chinese role has been quite small in the grand scheme of things. I mean, if China hadn't existed, the history of Libya would have been basically the same of the last 9 years. The other thing that I would like to say about China is that you have this tacit arrangement between Russia and China that acknowledges the fact that when it comes to being the vanguard, in terms of being the expert when it comes to the Middle East and North Africa, Russia is trusted. Russia is the spearhead, if you will. And China is not in the business of contradicting Russia. Russia is more nimble, it has more experience, it's more risk prone. China thinks in terms of what happens over the next 15 years. Is not in a hurry. And also you have geographically a peculiar fact when it comes to China. China looks at Africa going from the east into the west. As a result, getting access to this passageway in Northern Africa is not as essential as it has been for Turkey and Russia. So if you're looking for China in Libya, just look for Russia. That's China within the next 10 years. When it comes to the investments, it hasn't really been a big game changer. Right now, what's also interesting when it comes to the stance of China is if the GNA does prevail, China has a great relationship with it. If Haftar miraculously were to prevail, China has a great relationship with them. And if both prevail in their own little quarter, it will do business with both. It doesn't care, and it's certainly not in a hurry.
Jill, let me stay with you as we come to the closeout of our program today. But a couple other points we wanted to touch on. Number one is this idea of any sort of ceasefire, any sort of truce, any sort of coalition, possible government between the GNA and Prime Minister Sarraj and Marshal Haftar with the LNA. Is that a reality, or are we living in a dream world when it comes to the possibility of seeing at least a coalition government in Libya?
I think there's unfortunately a big asymmetry when you look at the military capabilities that have been put together by Turkey in the West. Now in Western Libya, you have a very serious actor when it comes to its ability to project militarily. And there's still something missing in the East. Mainly, among other things, Egypt. Egypt is not that eager to be present physically in the eastern half of Libya. Because of that imbalance, you'll have a very strong temptation on the part of the GNA in Tripoli to resolve every diplomatic issue that really should be resolved, in a civilized way behind closed doors. All those problems are going to be addressed on the battlefield, unfortunately. If with the passage of time, there's a greater amount of mobilization in the military space, I'm almost like hoping for more military power in the east to reduce the overall amount of violence in Libya. And I think that should be the objective. Economically, there are opportunities. But unfortunately, in terms of territorial control, the oil croissant, this series of terminals that combined are capable of exporting more than 600,000 barrels a day, that little piece of land is really something that both the Tripoli government and its Turkish sponsor really want. And that has to unfortunately unfold. I think in all likelihood, it's going to unfold in the military sphere, and
Right.
after that, and diplomacy will have to kick in after that. And I think there's a lot of things that could be achieved in terms of intelligent economic agreements and all kinds of imaginative diplomacy to avoid the breakup, to avoid the continued super acute economic crisis that Libya has been in throughout this year.
Emadeddin, jump to you on this one, following up on Jalil's comments, is that strip of land that contains the oil riches for Libya, is that a game changer as far as being a positive and bringing together a possible coalition and some sort of stability inside Libya? Or is it too much of an outlier that could be a possible poke in the eye to the Emirates, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia? How does this play out?
Okay, well, look at it from this perspective. Pre-April 4th, and to an extent, what is still currently happening,
Right.
there were institutionally speaking, there were two sides to this conflict, two large coalitions. One had control over the central bank, one had control over the oil crescent, and both are kind of leverages in a political process of sorts. So Haftar right now's only leverage is in a political process, and even his Eastern Libyan bloc as a whole, the LAAF, the Libyan Arab Armed Forces as a whole, they're only leverage in a political process of sorts that would come out either concomitantly with military operations ongoing or after military operations are done. The only leverage that he has, virtually speaking, is control over the oil crescent. And I do think that Turkey intends to take that away. And I do also think that the injection of military hardware that we are seeing right now in Western Libya is geared towards doing that. It won't happen as quickly as the kind of capture or pushback of the Tripoli offensive or the offensive on Western Libya happened. It will happen over probably a bloodier conflict and a larger period of time. But at this juncture, if no one gets involved on Haftar's side overtly speaking, and in this case, it's probably Egypt that will do that, if it does, although it has no appetite to do so right now. But the only differentiating, let's say, factor that would make a difference for Haftar and the Eastern Libyan bloc as a whole is if Egypt gets involved. Otherwise, the way the conflict is currently happening, it is very likely that the GNA aligned forces will capture the oil crescent. And Turkey has a long-term plan, to be honest, at this stage. It has a long-term plan for reforming the security sector in Western Libya. It has a long-term plan for what it would like its bilateral ties with Libya to look like. And you also have to take into account that its maritime agreement is, or the land, let's say the strip of land through which the maritime borders it shares with Libya are with Eastern Libya, not with Western Libya. So it does have an incentive to bring Eastern Libya to the fold in one way or another. I do think that bringing it to the fold while it has the oil crescent is difficult. So it will try to take that away and then bring it to the fold in one way, shape, or form afterwards.
Very good. We're way over time on today. I could keep going with this topic, It is such an important topic, both not only here domestically in the United States and U.S. foreign policy, but just from a global aspect. Just one last question for the panelists, and we'll go around the horn. Emily, we'll start with you. Is there the possibility that we could see a stabilized, peaceful Libya in this generation? Emily, start with you.
Excuse me. I would, I'm an optimist. I would hope so. I think that is going to, there are a lot of moving parts that would come into that actually becoming a reality for us. I mean, we have so many, different global actors who are playing different parts. We have, but I do think that it is a possibility. And I think with accountability and with, so, I hope so. I hope so.
Right.
I really do. It would take a massive effort, a lot of cooperation, but I definitely would hope so. But I certainly think it's possible.
Pervez, question to you, sir. Do we see a stabilized, peaceful Libya in this generation?
Yes, I'm also an optimist, but there are so many outside players in Libya. I mean, that makes it very chaotic. In short and medium term, I see, there will be no geographical partition of Libya as such, but there will be a zone of influence in the east and western side, as Turkey will try to, to the coastal belt that starts from the Sirte, the oil crescent till Benghazi and Tobruk. So it will take time, but this will only be possible, with the emergence of heavy military involvement of one side and the other side, receding, but still it will take, quite a lot of time. Short and medium term, the zone of influence will remain there between West and East Libya.
Jalel, to you, same question, sir.
As I said earlier, I think there is unfortunately a series of battles that are first of all are likely to happen, I think, and they're not going to necessarily be as short as President Erdogan would love, or even Tripoli. I think they're still quite euphoric right now because of all the achievements that they have pulled off over the last several weeks. So I see, us being busy with watching potentially ugly battles across a big chunk of Libya over the next several weeks. After that, if, as Imad said, if Egypt does its homework, there's going to be slightly more balance, and things will have settled down maybe a little bit, but it will still be a living humiliation, a constant humiliation for European diplomacy.
Ahmad, to you, same question.
I mean, from being the only Libyan, let's say, on the panel, I haven't seen Libyan society as polarized as we've seen it. This is probably the most it's been polarized in the past 9 years after the revolution, I will say. So whether in this generation, whether my generation, let's say, will manage to get out of this cycle, I don't know. I think this will carry away in the next probably generation. That's my personal reading of things. So I don't think this will be the last war, as a lot of people put it last year, thinking that this would either winners or losers would emerge, and Haftar would go out of the picture, or he would win. I don't think that things will be as neat or as simple, and I don't think we've seen the last of conflicts in Libya at large. So it's an unfortunate and grim reading, maybe, but it's more reflective of reality from my perspective, at least.
All right. Well, I'm going to let that be the last word. Badi, Jalel Harchaoui, Emily Leslie, Pervez Bilgrami. Thank you so much for joining us today. This has been fascinating. Again, I could do this for hours, but hopefully we'll take this topic up again here in the near future, and hope that we can count on your participation, because you guys are a wealth of information. Again, special thanks again to Alyssa Bonk, our program director, for setting this all up. Also, another special thanks to Kayla Murphy, who is our summer associate. She helps me look really smart in a lot of this. Thank you to the participants. Alyssa, do you want to give a shout out as far as the center goes?
Yes. If anybody would like to keep up with us, we are on Twitter, Facebook. We have a YouTube channel. You can follow us at NYCFPA. We are on Instagram as well. You can email us. My email with the center is alyssa.bonk@nycfpa.org. And I just wanted, again, to echo Justin's sentiment in thanking our panelists for their time and their expertise, and then also our attendees for giving them us their time today.
Yep. And also check out our website, NYCFPA.org. You can see updates, and you can also see our schedule of the next episode of this series of foreign policy discussions. Hopefully we'll be able to do it in person in the next couple of months. But other than that, once again, everybody, thanks for your participation. Thanks for everybody's involvement and interest, and we'll see you soon. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Also,